Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Clean Arctic Alliance's webinar, Polar Fuels, from a concept to a solution to reduce black carbon emissions from Arctic shipping. As we get started, I'd just like to quickly mention two housekeeping matters. First of all, please note that the webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website after today. We're going to be running the webinar twice today to accommodate different time zones, and we have different speakers for each of the two sessions. So please feel free to watch the other webinar once it is uploaded onto the website. And then secondly, if you have any questions, could you please try and indicate to which speaker your question is directed, and then submit it via the Q&A function, which I think will be at towards the bottom of your screen. We'll endeavour to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And if we can't, we'll try and follow up afterwards. I'm just going to start off with a few words to sort of set the scene and the context of the webinar. And then I'm going to introduce all three speakers in one go at the beginning and let them just hand over from one to the next rather than jumping in and out all the time. After the three presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. I hope we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So we should have, do feel free to put your questions into the Q&A function. And then we'll wrap up in about an hour's time. So just to sort of set the scene a little bit, I'm going to just say a little bit about where things are at in terms of black carbon and why we're running the webinar today. Black carbon is widely recognized to be a super pollutant because of the outsized impact it has on both human health and on climate, and particularly when it is emitted in the Arctic. It has an impact of 1,600 times the equivalent amount of CO2 on a 20-year global warming potential basis. And earlier this year, it was reported that together with methane and ozone, black carbon has contributed to nearly half of the global warming experience to date. In March this year, the winter sea ice extent in the Arctic was at its lowest ever. So it's clear that we are losing the polar regions, and that's important because the polar regions are effectively the regulators of the global climate. And this is in part due to black carbon emissions. It isn't just a problem for the people and the wildlife of the Arctic, it is a problem for the whole global population. As the sea ice has retreated over the past decade, shipping has increased in the Arctic by around a third in terms of the numbers of ships, but in terms of the distances being sailed, they have more than doubled. And recently, a new commercial container route has opened up or has commenced, starting in Southeast Asia via the Northern Sea route to Europe. The ship is actually en route at the moment. Increased shipping in the Arctic is inevitably leading to an increase in climate pollution and health impacts in the Arctic, and particularly as a consequence of emissions of black carbon. And black carbon emissions can, we believe, be fairly simply reduced in terms of the volume by choosing to use cleaner fuels. Early in 2026, the IMO's Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee meets with an opportunity to discuss concrete proposals. There's been an invitation for concrete proposals to be put forward on the use of polar fuels as a measure to reduce the impact of black carbon emissions on the Arctic. And the proposals will need to be submitted to the meeting by early December this year. So this webinar is looking to discuss what fuels are suitable for use in the Arctic, and discussions have been ongoing for some time, both at the IMO and in the interim, around polar fuels, and a number of issues have been identified that will benefit from further deliberation and discussion, including the impact of black carbon on the Arctic and on health, the characteristics of those fuels that might be suitable for use in the Arctic, the opportunity of using polar fuels, and by that I mean the availability of fuels and the switching between traditional residual fuels and lighter, cleaner fuels. The impact of designations such as emission control areas on the choice of fuels for use in the Arctic, and on the scope of any measures that seek to reduce the impact of black carbon on the Arctic. And I anticipate that we will touch on these issues during today's webinar. The webinar will also share perspectives and hopefully contribute to a shared understanding of the concept of polar fuels for use in the Arctic as a way of reducing shipping's climate impact and its impact on the Arctic. As I said, I'm going to introduce the three speakers in one go now, and then we'll pass straight from one presentation to the next. So our first speaker is going to be Dr. Liudmila Osipova, who is a senior researcher with the Marine International Council on Clean Transportation team. She is processing a global ship operations data analysis for a number of projects to include fuel switching cost analyses in Canadian mining, and evaluating a Japanese proposal to reduce CO2 emissions from existing ships via engine derating. She holds an MS degree in environmental science and policy from Clark University in the USA, and a dual PhD degree in quantitative and spatial ecology from Bangor University, UK, and the University of Göttingen in Germany. She is a Fulbright US and Australian Endeavour Leadership Scholar alumni. Our second speaker is John Bradshaw, who is Technical Director for Environment and Safety for the World Shipping Council, a global role that is located in Singapore. In addition to supporting environmental work at the IMO and the EU, John adds to World Shipping Council's capabilities in the Asia-Pacific region on both environmental and safety matters. John is a maritime regulatory specialist and marine engineer with a broad range of senior level experience with maritime engineering, technical and policy matters, including representing the shipping industry at the IMO. His work has focused particularly on climate change mitigation measures and emissions to the air. And then our final speaker during this webinar will be Bill Hemmings, who is a technical advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance. Bill is based in Brussels and works independently on shipping and aviation, air pollution and climate issues, and advises the Clean Arctic Alliance on fuels and black carbon emissions. He has previously been involved through the Clean Shipping Coalition on major IMO decisions under MARPOL Annex 6 on air pollution and on addressing ship greenhouse gas emissions. So those are our three speakers. I'm going to hand over first to Liudmila, and then Liudmila, if you could hand over to John, and then John to Bill. I will see you all again when we get to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Let me first share my screen. And we will start. All right. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are right now. As Sean introduced, my name is Liudmila. I'm a marine researcher at the International Council on Clean Transportation, and I've been working on the shipping black carbon emission in the Arctic already for over 6 years with the ICCT. I started to work on this issue right from joining the organization, and my work was mostly on data analytics. So I used the AIS data, process the data, and look at the different fuel and ship composition in the Arctic, at the different extent of the Arctic, to see what are the trends. Overall, in the ICCT, we are involved in black carbon tracking since 10 years already, maybe even over 10 years by now. And so we can actually look at the extent of emission and how they change over time. So we have a pretty much good data set by now to see what are the trends in the past, and what kind of trends we're expecting in the future. First, I would like to start with the Arctic definition. When we just started to do analysis of the Arctic, the main and the most sort of intuitive way to do that was to look at the geographic scope, a geographic extent of the Arctic, which is approximately at or above 59-60 degrees north. But once we started to get more and more involved with the International Maritime Organization, we actually, and also through the Clean Arctic Alliance advising, we realized that actually the real policy making scope is much smaller. Here on the map, you see this yellow line, and this is the IMO polar code definition of the Arctic that's used by the International Maritime Organization for policy making. And this is basically, it was developed for mostly safety measure and environmental protection, but mainly for safety measure. So that's the scope that the IMO work on. And as you can see, it's significantly smaller than the geographic extent of the Arctic. There are also other definitions of the Arctic that are important to take into consideration. Here on the map, you see the red line showing the Arctic definition, which is the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. The scope of the coverage of the Arctic here is a bit different from the others, because it's actually partly covered the terrestrial part of the Arctic as well. The green line show a HDR definition, which the boundaries, which is the program Arctic Human Development Program, and they included in the scope of the Arctic also a human right dimension. So as you can see, this is quite a complex landscape. So and the overall making policy decisions is quite complicated, considering that there is no sort of agreed scope. However, there is a tendency use the smaller scope of definition, which is the IMO Polar Code, including actually the EU Commission work. The EU work on the Arctic usually is limited to the IMO Arctic. So we at the TCT decided to look into the different scope of emissions within IMO Polar Code and geographic Arctic, just to see what is the scale of differences. So here on the map, you see the data from 2021. This is the black carbon emission distribution in the above approximately 59 degrees. You see where the stronger the color, the higher the pollution in the area. We estimated that in 2021, the geographic Arctic have been crossed by approximately 8,600 vessels, and they emitted 1.5 kiloton of black carbon. This excludes the Baltic Sea that partly lies above 59 degrees, but they exclude from the Arctic definition because for other social economical reasons. So that's the situation in geographic Arctic. And here on the blue line, you see the IMO Polar Code Arctic definition. So we also estimated the emissions there. And as you can see, it covers only about 2,000 vessels out of almost 9,000 vessels in the Arctic. And black carbon emissions also covered not in the full scope. And this difference is striking because if we want to introduce some sort of regulations, or at least assess the situation in the Arctic, we have to take into account the most dense emission hotspots. And as you can see on the map, they lie exactly outside of the IMO Polar Code. And this is a very important discovery, since the black carbon emissions, they don't have those borders. They travel on the distances. So here we're talking about exact emissions. So each pixel on this map shows the concentration of black carbon that happened in this area, but they actually travel and also they mixed with other pollutants. In the Arctic, it's an urgent issue because besides just being a part of particulate matter affecting the health impact, including indigenous people health impact, it also accumulates over the snow. You might, if you're interested in the Arctic environmental issues, you might see in a lot of pictures showing this black ice and black sea, especially with the routes where the ships are passing. this is the black carbon that settled down and being accumulated over the ice. It decreased the albedo of the surface, meaning that the sun, instead of being reflected, actually getting the energy getting absorbed, and the ice is melting in accelerated way. The fleet composition is also different for the IMO Polar Code Arctic and for the geographic Arctic. Here, side by side, I plotted the top 10 flag states that the ships are registered at and sailing in 2 scopes of the Arctic. You see that for the IMO Arctic, almost half of the ships are actually Russian flagged ships. Followed by Cyprus and Bahamas flag of conveniences. While for geographic Arctic, actually, the Russia is only second to Norway. And this makes a significant differences because as much as Russian shipping, we have only sort of limited capacities to discuss or affect at the moment. The Norway flagships actually, Norway is a part of the bigger economical European zone, and have to follow completely different regulations, and seeing such striking differences in the flag states where geographic Arctic still unregulated, it's not in the scope of any regulation basically right now. This is a very important difference from a geopolitical point of view. There is also a very different fuel used in these 2 scopes. While at the IMO Arctic, we see that slightly over the half of fuels that are used there are still residual fuels. These are low sulfur fuel oils. And in the IMO Arctic, we see that most of the ships are using residuals. In the geographic Arctic, in fact, there is already a prevalent fuel used is distillate. And while there is a huge difference between emission portfolio of these 2 fuels, this doesn't mean that the distillate fuels do not have any impact or black carbon in it. This difference is explained by the fact that in the bigger geographical scope, if you look at the map, it's actually a very big fishing activities area. And fishing ships historically are smaller. They usually are smaller, besides maybe some bigger industrial shipping vessels, and they tend to use distillates as well as passenger transport crossing this area. Again, why is it important? The fleet composition and fuel composition is extremely important in terms of what policy making solutions are being offered. For instance, when fishing vessels are often outside of the scope of the IMO work. Often it's actually domestic shipping as well. And to understand that, let's say, in geographic scope, the majority of black carbon emissions being produced by the distillate, just because by the volume of the shipping there, and that stays completely unregulated, is an important difference. Although the cutting emissions from residuals is definitely more urgent task that we have to address. So that's basically all from my side. I tried to keep it short so I had more time for questions. Also, if you have any afterward questions, I left my email here and will be happy to address it. Just feel free to reach out anytime. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Liudmila. Jean Bradshaw, so I'm from the World Shipping Council. As I think most of you already appreciate, we represent a line of shipping, so that's container lines, but also vehicle carriers. And I've been asked just to share a few thoughts on the problem of black carbon from our perspective. And I think everybody would agree with the opening remarks of Sean that black carbon it's clearly a climate forcing agent. It's a criteria emission and a public health hazard. So there are very good reasons for looking at this problem. One of the key parts of, not the solution, but key parts of understanding the problem is actually in the definition. So 10 years ago, and it is actually 10 years ago now, IMO agreed the Bondial definition for black carbon. And three elements of that that are crucially important to understand the problem and also potential solutions and limitations to potential solutions are the fact that it arises from incomplete combustion and that the black carbon is refractory and insoluble, and that has significant implications. For example, if you wanted to use a post-combustion solution, that's why exhaust gas cleaning systems have given very mixed results, because it is insoluble. So if we look at black carbon, the fact that it's the result of incomplete combustion, that indicates some of the issues around the engine design, the engine condition, the operational profile of the engine, but also the fuel composition. One of the things I guess that I would say is we fully accept the influence of fuel composition. There's no doubt about that at all. But fuel composition is one of many variables. And I think we have to recognise that fuel itself is not a panacea until we start going into the ZNZ fuels that will be already entering the industry. However, in terms of practicality, we have to consider what's achievable. In an ideal world, an emission like black carbon would need a multi-vector solution because of the number of variables. But what can IMO realistically do in the short to mid-term? In the longer term, really the long-term answer is to move away to alternative fuels that won't actually produce the black carbon to start with. But that's a long-term aspiration. If we look at the short term, then we are looking at things like polar fuel criteria. And the reason I use criteria rather than polar fuel standard is if we say polar fuel standard, people might interpret that we need a new ISO fuel standard. And actually, it seems pretty clear that if we can define polar fuel criteria, that those criteria are already addressed by the ISO standards for middle distillate fuels that we already have. And that would significantly reduce work because IMO wouldn't need to actually define a polar fuel standard. They would only have to define the criteria and that could be assessed against the existing fuel standards. Longer term, really a better solution would be an emission limit value, but that would require a monitoring protocol measurement, and we would have to define an emission limit. And I think it's fair to say that that would take longer to develop than the polar fuel criteria. However, if the world and IMO is serious about black carbon, I think that has to remain part of the discussion, especially now that I think everybody's agreed that filter smoke number correlates very well with the more exotic measurement technologies such as LII and PES. FSN is a very low-cost, simple, robust technique. As Liudmila has already highlighted, if IMO was to consider polar fuel criteria, then there's the whole question of the geographic scope of those controls. Our position is we would prefer a single definition of Arctic. That doesn't necessarily mean that IMO can amend the polar definition. What we're saying is whatever we do, we would prefer a single definition of Arctic waters, just in terms of implementation and assisting the world to understand where we are and what we have to comply with. And finally, it is, I think IMO needs to really decide what it wants to do with black carbon. I've been monitoring this debate for, I think, 15 years now. And as I say, I was actually there when we agreed the Bondial definition, and that's 10 years ago now. And it's really not healthy for IMO to come back every year and invite new proposals or invite further measurement. So whatever IMO is going to do, if it's a polar fuel criteria approach, IMO rather really needs to make that decision, because we're all aware of the timeline for regulatory changes at IMO. Even if we could agree at the next PPR, then it would have to go to the next MEPC for agreement and adoption at the next one. So we're looking several years from entry into force. And I guess probably the main thing I would say today is that IMO really needs to make a decision. Is it going to address this? Is it going to look at regulations? And if so, it really needs to start acting, because it's not really helping anything to just keep coming back every year. We've been doing it now for 15 years. And with that, I'll hand over to Bill. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, or good evening, wherever you are. I'm Bill Hemmings, based in Brussels. Well, it's hard to follow both Liudmila and John. Liudmila gave an excellent explanation of the complexities of the scope and the fuels, and John the options. Like John, I was there 15 years ago, and not only do we urgently need to do something about climate warming in the Arctic, but some of us are getting rather old and frustrated that it takes so long. John made clear that, a long-term, a standard, you can't emit more than so much black carbon per ton of fuel used or unit of fuel used, is probably a good approach, but it will take quite some time to develop. And in fact, black carbon is the climate warming part of particulate matter. And back in 2008, the IMO, when they were amending MARPOL Annex 6, talked about having a particulate matter standard, but agreed that it would take quite some time to develop, and therefore, in order to ensure that there was quick action, the sulfur and marine fuels was regulated both globally from 2020 and from 2015 at a lower level, more stringent level in emission control areas. So we're talking about polar fuels, which ISO, the International Standards Organization that works on marine fuels, has actually proposed to the last PPR session some criteria which would, in their view, be good, cleaner fuels than residual fuels, and would have a good impact on reducing the black carbon from residual fuels. And as Liudmila said, there are a lot of fishing vessels in the Arctic which already use distillates. So an immediate switch to polar fuels from residual fuels wouldn't change the profile of emissions of black carbon from distillates, but it would have a significant impact, and that would depend, as John said, on other conditions, the engine load, the type of engine, etc. But given all of that, just the simple switch, and it's not actually difficult, because a lot of ships already, when they're sailing into ECAs, switch from residual fuels to distillate fuels. So we're not talking about creating some new concept that isn't already been commonly implemented by many ships around the world when they moved into emission control areas since 2015. So the IMO criteria, as John said, are criteria. This is the ISO latest fuel specifications, ISO 8217. It was the 7th edition, and it was released in May last year. It's 42 pages, or over 40 pages long, and it has all sorts of specifications about distillate fuels. There are 7 types of distillate fuels, and there are more types of residual fuels. And it's a guide. If you're on a ship and you need to order a fuel, well, you'll look up what fuel you want in the ISO commercial spec and tell the fuel supplier that's the fuel you want. But it's just like buying a car or buying a refrigerator. If something goes wrong with the product, you might go back to the shop that sold you the car or the fridge, or you'll go back to the manufacturer. But you don't get government involved. And ISO have made clear for a long time that they're in the business of setting commercial specifications for selling fuels to facilitate ships buying those fuels, not something that governments need to be involved in. So it's important to understand that when the fuel sulfur limits were implemented in MARPOL Annex 6 in 2015, this was a regulatory rule that you have to use a fuel that is in ECAs 0.1% or less, or globally 0.5 or less. Yeah. And if a ship gets inspected and it doesn't comply, then it's in trouble with the port authorities and the local authorities. But in fact, if the ship hadn't ordered the correct ECA compliant fuel, for instance, then it's in trouble. If in fact it had ordered an ECA compliant fuel, but the fuel supplier hadn't delivered it, then that's going to be a commercial argument between the fuel supplier. And so it's very important to understand that what we're proposing here with polar fuels, by the way, 97% of polar fuels are already 0.1% ECA compliant fuels, but not all of them. So when you're ordering any fuel, say to go into an emission control area, in addition to whatever the ISO specifications you want, you have to say whether it has to be an ECA compliant fuel or not. If you don't say that, then the obligation for that making that error or omission is on the ship. It's not on the fuel supplier. So there's that issue to understand why we've got to find a way in amending MARPOL that the IMO will set out the fuel criteria which any fuel supplier who knows ISO will understand, aha, that's a polar fuel, this ship wants to use it in the Arctic. And so the fuel supplier will know exactly what to supply. Whether we call them polar fuels, whether we call them Arctic polar fuels, they're also good questions we need to still think about, because this is an issue for the Arctic only. It's not an issue for the Antarctic. That's been handled completely separately. And so we need to think about actually the wording, and we've got time to do that. On geographic scope, there's already been discussion in the IMO, and MEPC has said, really, Bill Hemmings or the Clean Arctic Alliance, or they can have whatever views they like. But this is a UN organization, and these initiatives really need to come from member organizations. And since this is an Arctic issue, the feeling is that probably that initiative should be taken first by, or led rather by an Arctic state. And so that's also an issue which we really need to focus more seriously on in the next 1 or 2 months as PPR 13 gets closer. Just a word on ECAs, and Liudmila showed the polar code waters boundary, which on the European side, on the Atlantic side, is not a circle. It omits waters off Norway, around Iceland and the Faroes, which are not subject to persistent sea ice, which is what the polar code is intended to do to ensure that ships sailing in those waters observe special security and safety provisions. And so there's a big gap there, which Liudmila pointed out, where actually 2/3 of the black carbon from shipping is emitted. There you can see on the bottom right how much of the dark blue is not within the polar code waters. So we've got 2 new ECAs been agreed, one in the Canadian Arctic, and that ECA lies fully within polar code waters. And so it's within either the polar code scope or the wider geographic Arctic scope. The second one is the Norwegian Sea ECA down there on the bottom right, which, as you can see, is outside the polar code area. So a lot of ships, when sailing in those ECAs, will switch to distillates, because that's what ships do when they switch to distillates. But there's a 0.1% residual ULSFO, which was invented in 2015 to comply with the new rule that came in 2015. It's a residual fuel, and it actually leads to far higher black carbon emissions than would eventuate if you were burning a residual fuel. And so that's going to be a problem. Is that fuel going to be used much in the Arctic? I won't go into the details here, but refineries have issues about how much residual ULSFO they can produce. And since we now have a new Mediterranean SECA, and hopefully possibly one in the North Atlantic very soon, maybe those fuels will be mainly used there. But could they go into the Arctic? Yes or no? We need to think about that, and how would we address that? The other issue, of course, is scrubber use, which is allowed in ECAs, and that's heavy fuel oil, up to 3.5% by volume of sulfur. And the belief is that ships with scrubbers emit more black carbon than you would with distillates. The other issue, which depends on what happens in the IMO in 2 weeks' time, is whether the North Atlantic ECA going from Spain, Portugal, right up to Greenland and including the EEZs of Greenland, Iceland and Faroes, they will then become ECAs and therefore subject to these, you could say, residual use loopholes using ULSFO or scrubbers. And so the other thing we all need to think about in the next 4 to 6 weeks is these scope issues and the map that you see there. And as John said, you need something straightforward and simple. So how do we look at all those squiggly lines? Remember, they go over land as well, but we're only talking about the sea waters enclosed by any of those definitions. How do we come up with something that is wider than the polar code area, because that only includes 1/3 of emissions? How do we come up with something that the shipping industry, IMO member states can all agree is a good solution? It mightn't be a perfect solution, and maybe, as John said, we have to wait for these new fuels, but that will be quite some time. Or we might have to wait for a particulate matter standard, which would also take some time. But since so many ships already use distillates, pretty well all ships have distillates on board. How can we switch to polar fuel distillates in the Arctic and come up with a conclusion at PPR 13, which then can go quickly to the following MEPC meeting? And after 15 years, we can all breathe some sense of relief and go on to all these other big issues which are facing the shipping industry and indeed global climate change. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers. We will now move to the question and answer section of the webinar. So I'd like to ask all of the speakers to turn on your cameras, please, so that we can see the panel members. And also, please, just a reminder to anyone, if you've got a question that you'd like to raise, now's your opportunity. If you could use the Q&A function, which is, well, for me, it's at the bottom of the screen towards the right-hand side. Hopefully it's the same for most people. Please submit your questions if you have a question, and if you can indicate who it's directed to, that would be great. But if not, we'll work out who's best placed to answer it. And just to get us going, everyone's asked a lot of, not asked, sorry, everyone's talked about a lot of the different elements that I think are relevant in terms of a concrete proposal being brought forward to the next PPR meeting. But one thing that hasn't perhaps been touched on is the economic implications. And I think there are economic implications, obviously, in terms of switching fuels. But also in terms of the impact that black carbon is having on the environment and on human health as well. So I wondered if anyone has got any thoughts around the economic implications of a proposed measure. Is anyone willing to respond to or just say a few words around that? Liudmila, I can see you itching to, thank you.
I'm thinking from the point of view of the assessment that have been done recently for the Atlantic Emission Control Area, where we were looking at the costs of switching from residuals to distillates and other measure of reducing sulfur emissions. I would assume that the cost implication would be very similar, because it's also about switching to the cleaner fuel in the area. And wherever you look at the social economic benefits from such switching, it includes many factors, includes health of the people living in the area. It includes all kind of ecosystem services that are being lost because of the environmental impact, because of the pollution. And in this case, a very strong climate effect. If you take all these elements into account and compare it with the price of switching to cleaner fuels, which are actually widely available, it's not something that we need to invent in this area. They are always outperform. So that means that the social benefits that the states will have from such measures will be higher, economically speaking, than inactions. And it's often the case, and it's often being completely dismissed in this discourse, including the IMO discourse, that they're talking about how much it's going to cost for the industry, but they never talk about how much benefits it will bring to the states, actually, at the end of the day, in the long run.
Thank you. So we need to look at both the sort of economic and it's all economic, isn't it? But look at but both the costs of inaction as well as the cost of action, and balance. Look at the balance between those two elements. Thank you, Liudmila. We have a question from Stefano Porciello. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong, from Euractiv. Is there any government which is directly promoting clean polar fuels at the moment, and which countries are actively opposing them? Would anyone like to respond to that? Bill, maybe, or John?
Well, I don't think any state has been asked to declare their position yet. We're still in the discussion phase. And as I said, the belief is that both in terms of any decision at the IMO. It's a member state-led organization, so the initiative has to have to come from one or more member states, and also on geographic scope. It's not so much a question of changing the polar code scope, but what is a wider scope for black carbon than the polar code scope, which is based on safety of shipping in ice-covered waters. You know, I think we've been having a good dialogue over the last months and a good dialogue at PPR 12, and we're looking for a good dialogue at PPR 13. But, you know, states will declare their position at the appropriate time, which means that if a state or states want to make a proposal to PPR 13, there are deadlines for those submissions. It's likely that member states who are interested maybe in doing something will be talking amongst themselves, and you know, there are diplomatic discussions which are the purview of the states involved, and so let's not try and make assumptions or projections as to what's happening. So we need to wait until the deadlines, and then all member states, when they have these issues, if they're on the table at PPR 13. But just to say this, in our informal soundings, there are a good number of states and organizations that are observers to the IMO, which really understand also and understand the urgency that after 15 years, as John said, it's really time for something to happen. So we are quietly confident, but we're still working very hard. And I think all of us should be working very hard to try and get a decision at PPR to move forward, because the Arctic is not waiting, and climate change is not waiting. And after 15 years, I don't think anyone thought that when the initiative was put on the table in 2011, would be sitting around in 2025 and still trying to take a decision.
Thank you, Bill. And I think it's fair to say that in recent years, the discussions, that there's been increasing numbers of countries speaking up, wanting to see action, to see something happen, and to move this subject forward. So, as you say, that's hopefully enough support, or not support, but enough feeling now that we need to address this issue, and put it to bed. Did anyone want to add anything? Nope. We have another question, so I'm going to move on then. I'm going to apologize. I'm probably going to annihilate this name. Gosia, I don't know if that's correct or not. Thank you. Sorry, she's thanking everyone for the speakers, but she has a question as well, and particularly directed at Liudmila to start with, but everyone, I think, jump in with your views. Given the findings that BC black carbon and carbon dioxide emissions from EU regulated ships are nearly double those from EU flagged ships, this is a report I think ICCT published earlier this year, is there any space for enhanced action on the part of the European Union, either through the MRV, the monitoring, I always get that wrong, through the MRV regulation anyway, and other means? Liudmila, would you like to start us off, and then others jump in?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Maybe I can give a tiny bit of the background of this report for the others who didn't read it. Basically, what we were looking at is the EU commitment to reduce the impact from shipping in the Arctic. And there was a report affiliated to this commitment that showed that they estimated the scope of black carbon and CO2 emissions from EU ships using the flag-based approach, meaning that the ships under the EU flags estimated as a EU-affiliated shipping, which we, again, with the help of Clean Arctic Alliance, and had this conversation with Sean, I remember, and with Bill as well, on looking at this from point of view of, everybody knows that there are a lot of ships running under the flag of conveniences that are, maybe could be completely, economically speaking, EU shipping, and also geographically speaking, right, EU shipping, but not EU flagged ships. And we just wanted to dig into data and check, and we found that indeed the impact is highly underestimated if you just use simple flag-based approach. So, and coming back to the question, what kind of actions can be done with that? Well, since we do have this new regulation in the EU level, the FuelEU EU Maritime and EU ETS, and these regulations are based also, they also address the EU affiliated shipping, but the way how it's tangled is that the EU MRV, so the ships that have to report to EU MRV, these are the ones that are considered to be responsible for the emissions. And we believe that that's probably the best approach, to use the EU MRV collection data and maybe introduce additional parameters, like, for example, if ship goes or not goes to the Arctic, and add it to the EU MRV. That's at least the first step towards the tackling the scope, to understand what is happening in the Arctic from the EU regulated ships. It's one thing, but second thing, and that's something that should also be broadly discussed, is that the black carbon actually is not reported anywhere. So there's basically only a few organizations that are trying to track that. But if you look at the MRV systems, they do not have black carbon. Not to mention that till recently it was only CO2 emissions. Actually, there were not even full scope of CO2 equivalent emissions. So that's another issue that should be definitely addressed, and can be addressed through first adding it to the EU MRV, at least to understand the scope of problem, and then introduce the relevant measures. Yeah, and we believe that there is a conversation about it that is being postponed for a while already at the EU level, but it should happen next year, and we have hopes.
If I could just add, I'm sitting here in Brussels, the work that I see that Liudmila referred to suggested that in 2021, over 70% of large ships over 5,000 gross tons were actually calling or arriving at an EU port on the same journey as when they were going up into the wider Arctic, which suggests that these EU port calling ships captured by the EU MRV data, really are a very significant part of the problem. We're going to be doing some work to try and update that 21 study, but it's not available yet. But I think it just says that yes, there could be some further measures. At the moment, black carbon is not even included in the EU shipping regulation. But the first thing, I think, is to talk to European member states and emphasize the urgency of this issue after 15 years, emphasize that EU MRV ships over 5,000 gross tons are playing a very important role when they use residual fuels operating in Arctic waters, and try and get EU member states, either jointly or as many of them as possible, to lend their weight behind the moves over the next couple of months to really bring this to some sort of a useful and productive conclusion with a recommendation from PPR 13.
Thank you, Bill. And I think it's worth recognising that of the 8 Arctic states, 2 are EU members, and then there's another one that is also an EU member, but the part of the Arctic, Greenland, is not an EU member as such, or is not included in quite the same way. And then 2 further of the 8 are EEA members. So, I think the EU is important in this context, certainly. Anyone else? We have no further questions. We've got a couple of minutes if there is one last question, or alternatively, is there anything, John, Liudmila and Bill, that you would like to just add?
Yeah, Sean, just maybe a closing remark from me. And maybe with respect to the last topic of conversation, and yes, clearly the EU is a key player in maritime regulation, and the EU has an awful lot of influence. But I also think we need to maintain the focus on IMO for the simple reason that IMO is the global regulator. And if we look at the Arctic littoral states, I mean, the biggest Arctic littoral state is Russia, and then we have Canada. So if we want something effective in the Arctic, yes, the EU can make a big contribution. We all know that. But I think it really needs an IMO-led solution given the nature of the littoral state distribution. And yet, thank you to Bill, Sean, and Liudmila for today's shot. That's been very good. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And just quickly, because we're getting short of time now, there is one final question from Daniela on how can a positive outcome approval of the IMO net zero framework influence the conversation, enhance action around polar fuels. And because we're running short of time and I want to just say a couple of words in wrap up, I'm just going to quickly say that obviously the net zero framework, adoption of the net zero framework is important and it will have a bearing in terms of emissions. However, I think it is not going to result in action quickly enough to address the black carbon impact, because black carbon being a short-term, super pollutant having an impact in a very short time frame. I think there remains action that can be taken now to address black carbon that won't get wrapped up in the net zero frame or wouldn't be addressed through the net zero framework. But clearly the two approaches to address black carbon and to implement the net zero framework need to go hand in hand as we move forward. But we need action in the short term, and everyone is calling for action in the short term on super pollutants like black carbon and like methane. So apologies not for handing that to the panel, but I think because time's tight, we'll wrap up now. So thank you. And on the slide, as we're coming to the end of the webinar, we've put up a few brief take-home measures, obviously based on the Clean Arctic Alliance's thinking, but around the discussions that have been happening recently, addressing the impact of black carbon on the Arctic and the use of polar fuels. Clearly, there is an opportunity for PPR to address the urgency that's required for reducing black carbon emissions from shipping in the Arctic. There's an invitation for proposals to be submitted to the next meeting in the early part of next year, with a deadline for submissions this year in December. And I think it's clear now that we have a good understanding of what polar fuels or Arctic polar fuels, how they should be defined, and what characteristics are relevant in terms of these fuels. Obviously, more discussion is needed around the geographic scope of a measure. It certainly was clear from Liudmila's slide that if we don't address the black carbon emissions that are coming from ships outside of the Polar Code definition of the Arctic waters, then we're not going to be addressing the problem sufficiently. And we also need, if there's to be a measure, we need to have some discussion around exactly what that looks like. And so that needs to be discussed in some detail and perhaps put on paper so that there can be a more substantive discussion around it and submitted to the PPR meeting for full investigation and discussion. And I think, as Bill made the point very clearly, we need an IMO member state to step up and to put a proposal in. You know, we can keep putting in proposals from the environmental NGOs, from the shipping NGOs, but at the end of the day, it's the IMO member states that need to take the initiative here. So thank you. First of all, thank you to our speakers today. Thank you to Liudmila, to John, and to Bill. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank all of the participants and for the questions that came from the audience as well. So thank you for joining us today and contributing to the discussion. As I said at the beginning, it's our intention to make the recording of the webinar available on our website, and details will be circulated to participants in due course. And in the meantime, I hope that you found the discussion useful, and we would welcome feedback if you have any on how we can make significant progress on this important issue. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.